You've spent months working on this amazing model with all of this spectacular detail, and now it's time to show off your trophy with a great photograph. Stick around, and I'm going to show you how to transform your model kit photography from this to this. From the photo shoot to post-production, I'm going to share with you all of the processes that I use that I think you need to know about. My name is Ken Pearson, and this is Ken Pearson Photography. Before we begin, there's a couple of assumptions that I've made when putting together this tutorial. The first being, you understand how to use your camera in manual mode. You know what ISO is, aperture, and shutter speed are, and you understand how they all work together and influence one another. The second being that you have a basic understanding of Adobe Lightroom. In this case, I'll be using a Lightroom Classic, and you know how to correct exposure, adjust highlights, midtones, and so on and so forth. Nothing big. You also have a basic understanding of Adobe Photoshop. In this example, I'll be covering layers, brushes, and smart objects. Again, nothing sophisticated. This is really going to be novice routines that will be going through all of these different applications. And finally, I'm going to be using NIK Color Efex Pro, which is now published by DxO. This isn't going to be a tutorial in Color Efex Pro, but you'll see how I use some of the recipes to achieve the final results of the image. Okay, so this is the model that I'm going to be using in the photo shoot. And I really enjoy this model. It's got a lot of great detail. It's very photogenic. And there's a couple things that I want to talk about before I get into the photo shoot itself. The first thing I'm going to tell you is that no matter which direction you go, always begin with the end in mind. You've probably heard that before. It's just visualize where it is that you want to be. In some cases, I've even drawn sketches just loosely. I'm not that good an artist, but I like to just draw some pictures and say, okay, this is maybe how the composition should look and whatnot. You'll see I test this out in Photoshop as well during the tutorial. We'll do some comp setups and some layouts, but in this instance over here, know where you're going, and that's going to help you get there along the way because you're going to know exactly what you want to be shooting and filming along the way. So it's going to be extremely helpful. So in this instance over here, there's two types of photographs I could be taking of my model. The first one is going to be an exhibition photo. Okay, so imagine for a moment that this is a photograph that's going to be used in a publication or on a website or anything that's going to be exhibiting your work in some sort of media. I would also say that when you think of this, think of only being able to take one photo of it. So when you think of it in those terms, you want to get as much coverage as you possibly can. So for instance, something like this, you might want to, show the top or show like a 45-degree angle, something that just, accentuates everything that you've done on this, and it really just, takes the model and shows everybody, wow, how look how much great detail there is, and look how intricate this is, and look at the work. It's really showing it off. Okay, those kinds of photos though don't necessarily fit into the next kind of photo, which would be one that's going to be included in a story. So when I'm telling a story with the model, what I like to do is it's like seeing a frame from a film captured. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean that the model in that case has to be showing off all of its detail. What you're now doing is you're taking the model and you're putting it into an action pose. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to show off every single nook and cranny. As a matter of fact, in my design, my plan is to have two of these, and the first one is going to look like it's going to be flying past the camera. Okay, and so you're missing all the detail in the back. But that's not what I'm here for, okay? That's not what that picture is there for. So I want to give an action pose of this flying by, okay? I might not even see the guy inside because there could be some glare off of the window. I'm expecting all of these things. So I just really want to put this into an action pose. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to use this exact same model to have a second vehicle in there, okay? And so what I've chosen to do is something that's going to be higher up like this, where in this instance, I might be able to show off more of the belly, some of the other side. So if you want to do that, you can use two models in the same picture to show off more of the detail. Now we'll also be talking about how to make subtle differences to each one of those so they don't look like it's the same model that's being filmed twice. and put into the same picture, because that would look a little bit hokey, okay? So we'll talk about changing up some of the scratches, some cleanup in certain areas, color changes, and so on and so forth, okay? So there's that. The other important thing about photographing your models when you're going to be using two of them, and it doesn't make a difference whether or not it's the same one or two entirely different models, if you sketch it out first and you know exactly what your finished product is supposed to look like, then that's going to be hugely helpful in determining how you're going to photograph those. So for instance, we know that the first one is going to be looking something like this, and we also know that the second one is going to be sort of showing off the bottom like this, okay? So what's significant about those two poses, even though they're different, is that the light source needs to be the same. So I want to photograph those in the exact same postures that I'm showing them to you right now. So the light is going to be consistent on both models. Shadows are where they're supposed to be, highlights are where they're supposed to be on both. Nothing drives me crazy more when I even see movie posters where the shadows of people that are in the same photo are not even in the same positions. So we want to make sure that we're going to photograph them this way. You have total control of your environment. Those are things you should be taking in consideration when you're going to be shooting those, okay? And so that said, we get the sun coming from behind us. It's going to be, you know, it's going to look good. It's going to look real. So we want to do that. As it relates to the camera equipment, I highly recommend that you're either going to use a DSLR or a mirrorless digital camera, okay? So in this instance over here, I'm using a Nikon D850, it's a DSLR. The lens that I'm using on here right now is going to be the 24-70. I also use a D800, and I've experimented with a couple of other lenses during this photo shoot. The go-to lens is the Nikor 24-70 in this case, okay? You're going to want to use an interchangeable lens, not a prime lens. You're going to want to use a lens that you can rack focus in, all right? And the reason we're going to have to rack focus in this is because we're going to do focus stacking with our imagery. So when we're taking photos in the model, what we're going to be doing is we're going to focus on the front of it and take an image as we move focus from front to back. And this is going to give us a crystal clear image of the model, and it's going to be completely in focus. It looks really, really great, so you can get great results. No matter the camera that you decide to use, you want to use something that's going to have a large megapixel count, okay? That's a recommendation. Now in this case, I'm using the D850, and the D850 has a 45 or 46 megapixel, I can't remember which one it is. It's 10 more megapixels or 9 more megapixels than the D800. So both are very high in megapixels, but I'm going to go mostly with the 850 just because the bigger the image, the more crop power I have. So I can crop in, I can shoot a little bit further back if I have to, and still retain a very crystal clear image quality, which is what I'm looking for, okay? And I think you certainly want to achieve those results where you can get as crystal clear as possible. As it relates to shooting in the light box, one thing that's important to note is that you have LED lights. You can pick these up online, by the way. Amazon has a bunch of them. You can get them anywhere between $30 and I guess $100, depending on what it is you're looking to accomplish. Each one of these kits has different sizes, and they also have different applications that come with them, different gels, things like that. So it all depends on what you're looking to do. This is very basic. I picked this one up on eBay for about $25. It's nothing but this box and 2 rows of LED lights across the top. Now, because I'm using this, it's not the same light intensity as what I would be getting from my flash photography. So my settings are going to be different when I'm working with this particular environment. So what's going to happen here is that I am going to have to shoot at ISO 200, which is what I want to shoot. That's the first setting I want to adjust. And the reason why I want to shoot at ISO 200 is because I want minimal grain in my photo, okay? If I'm going to compensate for lighting with my ISO in this situation and I crank up my ISO, I'm going to get grain in my photo, and that's not what I want. I want something crystal clear. So I'm going to have to reduce my ISO to about 200, which is what I'm going to shoot at. And then I'm going to open up my aperture to 2.8, okay? And I'm going to keep shooting in my focus racking, or focus stacking rather. I'm going to shoot from front to back at 2.8. And my shutter speed is probably going to be around 1/100th or 1/180th. Okay, it all depends on the actual lighting in the end, but I think I'm going with 1/100th. When I've done some test footage in this, that seemed to suffice. Okay, so I have to keep my shutter open longer because the lighting isn't as good as it's going to be as if I were shooting with flash photography. Okay, I get a little more controls over using my flashes and my soft boxes and so on and so forth. So just know your environment and what you're going to be working with, especially if you're going to be shooting this quite often like I plan on doing, that if I'm photographing models over and over again, I want to make sure that I get that right recipe that I can run and gun every single time I just get there and I start photographing my subjects. So that's what I'm going to be doing with that, probably, you know, not far away from what you see right behind me. I mean, I've got about maybe 3 feet of space shooting into the box. Okay, so there's that. Once the photo shoot is completed, we're going to bring all of our work into Lightroom and examine what it is that we want to use, and then make our corrections to the images that we want to use before we bring them into Photoshop. Then we'll bring them to Photoshop, do our focus stacking and a lot of other things that have to do with filters and layers and so on and so forth. We're going to finish that portion of the project, and we'll bring it into NIK Color Efex Pro and put our finishing touches on it. Okay, so at this point I've brought all of the images into Lightroom and I've gone through them and I've made some determinations as to which ones that I would like to use. So this is one of them, and you can see here that I've chosen one of the midsections where there's some detail, and then I've used some refinements in Lightroom off to the side over here. I'm not suggesting that these are the ones that you would be using. Of course, every image is different and your exposures are going to be different. And in this case, I've actually have a series that is underexposed, so I've gone ahead and compensated accordingly. Now, this is all of the different focus points that you can see here. So as I go from left to right, the front to the back of the plane goes more into focus, and so I want to blend all of these together. But before I do that, I need to get all of them to have the same exposure settings that you're seeing here. Okay, so I'm going to select all that are in the list down below that are part of this series, and I'm going to click on this over here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the center one that was already touched up, and then I'll click my synchronize feature, and then it'll apply it to all of the selected ones that I see here. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Alright, so now that I have that, what I want to do is I want to go over here and I'm going to choose from my limited assortment of the ones that I'm going to be considering to use. Before I go through all the extra effort of blending the focus stacking in Photoshop, what I want to do is I want to make sure that these are going to work for me, and so I'm going to create a draft comp. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this one and this one, and I'm going to select them both, and then I'm going to click Edit in, Open as Layers in Photoshop. Okay, here are my two images that have been now opened up in Photoshop. You can see they've been opened up as layers over here, okay? And all I'm doing at this point, this is part of my workflow, that I just want to make sure that these are the images I really do want to use, and so I'm going to try and sort them out in a comp to see what they may look like, okay? That way I don't have to waste my time getting into a bunch of detail for images that I'm not going to be using or not happy with. I want to be absolutely sure that all the time that I'm going to be investing going forward is going to be with these images. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create another layer down below. I'm going to drag it down here, again down and dirty, not even going to name it, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to make it white. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this image and I'm going to turn it off, and I'm going to go to the first image. Now again, this is just the way I'm working. You'll obviously get the gist of this, and then you can do whatever you want when you're doing this. So over here, I'm going to just kind of do something tight around here just so I can get an idea. Alright, now I want to make sure I'm on the right layer, okay? And then when I'm doing this, I'm going to go select, inverse, okay, inverse the selection, and I'm going to delete, okay? So now I have this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to convert to Smart Object, okay? You don't necessarily have to do this step because it's a draft, but I'm going to do it anyways, okay? Alright, then I'm going to go over here, turn this one off, turn this on, get rid of the mask. Alright, then I'm going to go back, inverse, delete, and then I'll do this, and then I'll go ahead and convert to smart object, okay? All right, now that I have these two, I can determine how I want them to look, okay? So I'm gonna use my move tool, just move this around, okay? If I need to, I'm gonna put one on top of the other. I think this is gonna be this one over here. And then we'll do something around here, okay? So do this up here and such. Okay, grab it, so this way if I want, I can start turning it around like this and so on. One thing to be careful about is that these were both photographed with the same lighting. The lights were in the same position. So what I really like to encourage, because I do this, is that if I wanted to do something where the plane was going to be tilted like this, I would have photographed it like that just to get the lighting consistent where the other model is photographed like this, okay? So the lighting would be consistent. A couple of other things you can see that when I'm using this, obviously these planes are the same, we know it's the same model, but one thing I'm going to want to do is start touching up these areas where you can see that I see the exact same scuff marks here as I do here. Anybody that looks at this long enough is going to go, hey, wait a second, you know, these are the same thing. So you want to make them look a little bit different, give some scratches someplace else and such, okay? Very important when you're using the same model in this case. So this looks like something that's going to work for me. The only thing that I would want to do a little bit different here would be in the one in the background. I know that we're going to put this in focus no matter what, 100%, but I am going to do something similar to this where I'm just going to take my blur tool underneath my filters, blurring, and I'll do my blur here, and see what we got. So give it some distance, okay? So that being the case as well, not only distance, but it's probably a little bit too big. Oops. And so I'm gonna, something like that, okay? I think we can work with that. So basically it's gonna look something like this. So I think my picks are good. Now again, it looks kind of odd just because this is blurry here, but everything's gonna be in focus, so this will look really, really nice when it's done. So we're gonna work with that. Again, put it in the middle. I might bring these down a little bit more just so there's more space around. That way I have more area around the borders with the background, and then I'll bring that in. Okay, all right. Now that I've got that, we're going to begin the next part of this process, which is going back to Lightroom and then beginning the focus stacking process. All right, now that we're back in Lightroom, what I want to do is I want to select the images that I'm going to be working with for this, and we're going to do the focus stacking in a moment. But what I want to do to organize this better is click on this, and then click on all the images by holding down my Shift key and selecting all of them, and then right click here, click on stacking, and then say group into stack. And once I do that, now you can see all of the images are layered on top of one another in a group here, which you can see that there's 14 images that are here, okay? All right, now that I've done that, what I wanna do is I wanna right click on this, and then I wanna go and say, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. Okay, so we're going to do that same process again, but now we're going to do it with 14. So depending on the processing power of your computer, this can take a little bit, okay? So we're going to do that here. We're going to let it open up, and then we're going to jump to the next step. Okay, so all of our layers have come through. We have all 14 of them here. And as you can see, when I turn off each layer, it reveals the next layer below it, and you can see the focus begins to go again, as we saw in Lightroom, from left to right, front to back, okay? So I'm going to turn them all on. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to select the first one, hold down my Shift key, select the last one, and then I'm going to go click on Edit, Auto Align Layers. That's the first step that I want to go through. So I'm going to do this, choose the first one, just click OK. No changes necessary here. And give it a second. Okay, now we can see everything has been lined up. Okay, so you notice here that there's been some adjustments made to the images and it's lined up each one of these layers perfectly. Now we're ready for the next step. We're going to select all of our layers again. We're going to go back to edit and then we're going to say auto blend layers. Okay, so I'm going to choose auto blend layers, and once again you don't have to do anything. Okay, so basically it's showing me here we're going to stack the images. We're going to take all of these different images here to make one single image. Okay, all right, leave these boxes checked, click OK, and then wait again. All right, this is our final image. Look at this. It just came together really, really nice. Now, of course, there can be more post-processing we're going to be doing to this, but this is a great starting point to work with, okay? Very, very clean, focused front to back. Very, very pleased. You can make some further adjustments over here, okay, by revealing some other layers to bring more areas into focus, just in case you feel that some areas may not be where you want them to be, but you know what? This is exceptional. I think this is really, really nice. So what I like to do at this point is I like to save this image. I want to save all of my steps along the way. So I'm going to keep a copy of this image, and then I'm going to move forward to work on the image further. Okay, so this is where I'm going to do all the cleanup, etc. So what am I going to do at this point? What I'd like to do is click duplicate, and then I'll call this one plane 1, and this is what we're going to work on. I'm going to click on this. All right, happy with that. And then I'm going to go over to layers in my new one, and I'm going to flatten the image. Okay, so I'm going to flatten the image, and now I'm going to bring everything together as one. Okay, I just want to work with this image now. Okay, so I have my original. If I ever need to step back, I've got this over here. I've got the merge layer at the top, but now I want to go ahead and flatten this image, and this is the image that we're going to work on next. Okay, and again, we're going to repeat this entire process for the other plane. I'm not going to do that in this tutorial. You'll understand the process when this is completed, but everything we're going to go back and do for the other plane. Okay, so in this part of the workflow, what we're really focusing on is cleaning up this object so we can place it in our final scene. Okay, so we're going to work on correcting things that are in the plane, some imperfections, etc., so we can place it in the final scene. There's not really much to do here, but I will say we're at the point where if we're not happy with what we're seeing and you want to use another image or you want to reshoot entirely, now's the time to do that, because going forward, even though it's not going to be complicated, some of the things that we're doing may be time consuming, and you might want to really make a determination at this point as to how much you want to invest in this image or the image that you have. Okay, again, for the sake of this exercise, we're happy with what we see, so we're going to go ahead and correct some things. And again, like I mentioned earlier, everything we're doing with this plane we'll be doing with the second one. I just won't be showing those steps or repeating those steps in the video. Also, for the sake of time, I've created some layers that I traditionally begin with. Now, I may experiment sometimes and duplicate the layers, put them into folders and make different sets, try different things, but I'm going to keep it easy, okay, for this particular tutorial. So the first thing I did was I right-click on my background layer. You can see that it's locked, and I duplicate the layer. And I always do that so I don't wreck my source. And when I duplicated that, I renamed it to call it master. Okay, then I created another layer and I filled it black and I put it below. All right, and this is going to help with my cutouts, because when I cut the plane out, then I can see the black background behind it. All right, and then I also created one called seams and touch-ups. Now I'll tell you that in this case I'm only going to create one layer for this, but depending on the complexity of what it is you're trying to do, you might want to classify your different layers for different types of touch-ups that you're making to a particular object, in this case the plane. Okay, so for instance, I could add some scratches and some maybe some bullet holes or something like that into the side of it. That might be a layer that I do on its own. I get very particular when it comes to segmenting all of my layers, so that way I have control of the things that I want to keep and that I want to change, or I don't want to have at all in the final image. Okay, So as it relates to this, I'm going to keep this extremely easy. Now you can cut this out first if you want. There's no particular order to this. You can cut it out first if you want, or you can do some of the touch-ups. What I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to show you some of the touch-ups that I'm going to make. And I'm not going to do all of them, but I'm just going to show you the ones that are kind of obvious. Now, first things first, when I made this model, I knew that I was going to be photographing it. And so I didn't give the attention to detail in some of the areas where it had to do with filling in seams and so on and so forth, because I knew that I had this tool available to me. This was specifically going to be for a photo shoot. And so I left the seams as they are, okay? So let's get right into it. I'm going to zoom in, okay, here. And I'm going to get real close. And then I'm going to click on the seams and touch-ups. And I'm going to use my clone tool for this. Okay, so there's a couple of things you can do, but the first thing you definitely want to make sure of, you want to make sure that you have current and below is selected. Okay, if you don't use it that often. I always use my clone tool on a new layer. I never use it on the source, okay, because you're disrupting the source. If you use it on a new layer and you use current and below, then you're not obstructing any of the actual image here, the actual layer itself. And you can see here it's pulling from the current and it's using the below textures and colors, okay? So let's get to it. I'm gonna start with this side over here, and I'm gonna clone like this. Sometimes I like to come up from the bottom, okay? So I get some consistencies where things look nice. I understand that this is gonna be extremely small and nobody's really gonna kind of notice this, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't give it some attention to detail here. Now you can see here that I don't really like the original source here, so I'm gonna you know, change that up just a little bit, okay, something like that. So now that looks pretty good. Okay, so I'll just do that. There we go. All right, so I'm gonna do this over here with this. All right, okay, perfect. So let's take a look. Yeah, looks good, right? No issues there. So a couple of other places that I would want to pay attention to are going to be other areas over here, which I'm going to do off camera. Okay, so I'm going to do this over here. You know, the bomb down here looks like it has a seam down the middle, which needs to be corrected. So anywhere you can find something like that, you're going to want to do. You're going to want to make some changes. The biggest piece, you see another one right over here. Okay, right here. So the biggest piece that's really going to need some fixing is going to be this, and I'm going to save that for last. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut everything out first, and then I'm going to sort of reconstruct this little dome area here using some of the same tools, same best practices here, shaping this up. And I'll do that towards the end of this cut up when I've got that there, okay, and I'll show you that. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this instance is I'm going to touch up this one gun by giving it a gun barrel, okay, hollowing out this barrel here, and then I will apply the same technique to the rest of the gun barrels. I'm just not going to do it in this tutorial, but you'll see them in the end result, and I'm going to use the same technique, okay? So here's what I'm going to do is I want to get into this one pretty tight, okay, to start with. And then I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call this one Gun 1, okay? All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my elliptical marquee and I'm going to draw a circle in here and try and get it to look a little bit realistic of what the barrel should look like, okay? By the way, when this is all said and done, I'm going to take care of this around here. Now, this is a bit soft on the focus, so I'm going to have to blend whatever it is that I'm doing over here because this marquee is going to be giving a real hard line here, okay? So I'm going to have to do some work on that. I'm just going to try and make that a little bit. Let's see if I can get. Okay, I'm happy with this. This looks relatively good. Okay, we can work with this. Okay. All right, so I'm on my layer gun 1, and now I'm going to use my clone stamp tool. And I know that there's people looking at this right now probably go, that's not the way I would do it. Okay, well, you know, if you have another way to do it, that's great, but I'm going to show you the way I'm doing it. So over here like this, what I'm going to do is this. I'm just going to take that. I'm going to undo that again and just give it a little more depth dimension like that. So look at that. Okay, perfect. Now the only thing that's wrong here is that that's too sharp for this focus. So what I'm going to do is, just for the simplest way to do it, to experiment, will be converting to a smart object, and then going into blur, Gaussian blur. Look at that. Okay, how's that? Perfect. I'm happy with that. I think it's great. Looks good. Okay, now I'm going to repeat that process, but look at that. Came out pretty well. Okay. Very inconspicuous. You wouldn't know any different. So I'm going to repeat that same process over here with these guns. Okay. Once I'm done with that, then I'll be able to start cutting out this image using my lasso tool. You can use the magnetic lasso depending on how easy it's going to be, or the just go around it with your this here and then cut it out. Okay, I will confess I don't use the magnetic lasso. I just go through this all, and it usually takes about 30 minutes or so just to get everything perfect. Okay, so but you do what you want to do, but the bottom line is we got to cut this out, and we'll jump to that step next. Okay, at this point, if I'm going to be using another image of the same model in my final composition, then this is where I'd want to make some final adjustments to the image. So for instance, if I have decals with the same numbers on them, or if there's maybe bullet holes or weathering or scratches that are really pronounced, and we're going to be looking at the planes or the vehicles from the same profile, then I definitely want to make sure that at this point we're going to make some of those adjustments to make sure that each one of the planes, even though they're the same vehicle, they have some unique qualities to them, so people don't feel or look at them going, hey, that's the same plane shot twice, it's just in different angles. We want to sort of give some of these unique characteristics to it. Okay, so this is where I'd make those final touch-ups. You could do it in both, or you can just do it in one, because only one really has to change. So in this case, I'm not going to make the changes and the adjustments in this image. I'm actually going to do it in the other one, because the other one also has the advantage of being blurred. So that one's going to be in the background, so I get to knock off some of the scratches, etc., and then just blur it, and the blurring itself will probably handle some of the difficulties when it comes to spotting some of the similarities between the two images. Okay. All right, so this is where we are in the workflow now. I've cut around the plane and I've put it on its own layer, and so you can see here that I can just move it around and do whatever I want. And what I've also done is, at this point, I've created a brand new document, and I've saved the other components of the workflow that I've done before in a previous document, again, saving my steps. Now I've created a new document where I've brought the plane in, and now I'm going to work on building in the background. Okay, so a couple of things to note. First, off to the side, I like at this point putting everything into folders. I like using folders a lot with my layers. And over here, I've created one called plane, and then I've put the plane in here, okay, into this one over here. And eventually what I'll be doing is I'll bring in the second plane, but we're not there yet. Then I've created one for sky, and that's where I'm going to be experimenting with the different sky options that I can work with, the background, the clouds, and all sorts of things there, okay? So you can see here that I can turn this on. This is what it looks like with a white background. Now I'm going to work on putting in another background, which is going to be the blue sky. So we're going to start with that. Again, like I said from the beginning, the reason why I want to just use the sky is because I'm going to do something very plain Jane, easy to do. You know, I've seen people do this too. If you want to go ahead and take a picture of the sky and put it in the background, you can do that too, but we're going to make our own sky here. It's pretty easy. I'm going to show you some of the stuff we're going to do. So I'm going to click on the sky folder in my layers. I'm going to call this one blue. Okay. And then I'm going to fill it with this blue that's here. Okay, so it all depends what you want to do. You can experiment with different blues. You can use different gradients if you want. I'm not really going to be doing that here. I'm just going to use a flat blue, and I'm going to put it in like that. Okay, something I like. So already it's looking a lot better. Okay, so it really looks nice with that blue. So now what I want to do is I'm going to make a new layer. Okay, so again, our layers are stacked accordingly, where the sky is in the background, it's going to be underneath the plane, and I'm going to start experimenting with clouds. This is going to be the easy part. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this one Clouds 1. Okay, this way when I'm using my brushes, I can have a little bit more control over, I can experiment a lot more with clouds, how I want them to look, and so on and so forth. And if I have too many clouds, I can turn some off, etc. So I'm not contaminating everything into one layer here. Okay, so I'm going to switch to white, and then I'm going to go take a look over here at my brushes. Okay, so underneath my brush settings, I have a couple of brushes here that I want to use. Once I select the brush tool, then I can choose which ones I want. So down below, as I go down here, look for something that is clouds. Let's do something like this, okay? All right, you see this? So I do that. It's kind of small, right? So I don't want to do that. So I'll do is I'll choose this one here, and then I'm going to just amp it up as much as I can. Okay, I'll go to 5,000. So you see here when I do this, all right, already look at this, very nice. So another thing you want to do when you're going to start stamping things, you can either overlay to give some more contrast to the clouds, so these ones look further in the back or lighter, and then you can make them darker here. But another thing that you're going to want to do is, if you just like double click, triple click, etc., then you're darkening that. But at the same time too, change the direction of the clouds as well, so the brush changes, so you don't look like you're just using a stamp tool of some sort to create clouds, right? So you go like this, do that here, and then you can right click and then just change here, okay? And then just start to add a little bit more. Sometimes what I like to do is back out of the image just to make sure that I'm getting the corners, okay? So things like this, it's very nice, right? I mean, this is really, really nice. So I'm not gonna do too much, okay? Just something like this. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into the brushes again, and look for the brush series that I was working with. And then, okay, so I was doing this, so I want to choose something different. So when I reset this, it's going to give me it's going to give me the actual brush intended size. Again, for the size of the image that I'm working with, you can change the brush size to anything you want, but I'm going to go over here, something larger. I'll just stick with the max, okay? Do that like that. And again, going over some of the things I've done already, it eliminates the look and feel that this is possibly a stamp. Okay, so I just want to do this, and of course one of the things I'll be doing is blurring this as well slightly. Okay, so I can do that. All right, so I'll do something else. Okay, so if you're wanting to experiment more and you're like, I don't want to overdo it now, I may be approaching a point where I'm like, maybe I need to get another layer in here just so I don't overdo this particular layer. So I'm going to do this one here, call it Clouds 2. So the advantage of working with another layer is that you can control the opacity, okay, of the brush that you're working with. All right, so you can do it when you're working with the brush. You can see that I have an opacity of 40%. That's what I was working with. Now what I can do is I can also change the opacity of the layer itself. So this is going to give me more control and more options here, that I can dim the clouds in one layer versus another. So I can just experiment a little bit more. Again, I want to keep some of that blue. I certainly don't want to make too many clouds and whatnot. Now what's also nice is just something you can experiment with here, is that you can, let's just go to the plane layer for a moment. Not that I would do it in this layer, but I'm going to make a temporary adjustment here, and I'll just say Clouds Front, okay? And then what you can do is you can even put clouds that are like, you know, over the wing, something like that. So it's like, it looks like it's coming out of the clouds. Okay. So things like that when you put the layers on top of the image that you're working with. Now, I don't like that. I'm going to use it later on with the other plane just to give it some contrast. But in this case here, I'm just sort of showing that off. So that's what we're working with at this point. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. And I think it's time to bring in the other plane. All right, so in the interest of time, what I've done is I've jumped ahead a little bit and I've brought in the second plane and some foreground clouds, and I'll be talking about these layers here in a moment. Now, there's nothing really spectacular that I've done that's new. Everything I've already demonstrated in working with this plane, I've just added with the second plane, but I'm going to talk about some additional steps and some things that I'm going to show you to just help give it some more balance and realism within the shoot. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about very quickly is going to be this plane. And so you can see I have a master and then I have a plane final below it. I do this just because I may want to make some little touch-ups along here and I don't want to mess up this master. So one of the other things to note about this is that in the master, you can see down below I've actually tilted the plane up a little bit. Okay, so I've given it a little bit more of a tilt. And what I was going for was to have the wing being straight. Okay, so the plane has a little bit more of an action pose to it. Again, like I said earlier, I don't want to tilt too much because I have a second plane with similar lighting in this, so I want to make sure that my lighting where the sun is hitting on the plane is consistent. My shadows are consistent with one another. So doing something small like this is not going to be a big deal. It's not that much of a change. But that's what I did here, okay? So I've got that. All right, that's the only adjustment I made with the plane and nothing else here, okay? So the next thing I did was I brought in my second plane, okay? So there's a couple things here that I'm going to talk about. Again, you can see here that I have a master plane. This is the original that I brought in, and then I duplicate it and I made a plane copy, okay? And the only thing I did here that's actually visible is the blurring, but I did make some other adjustments in the plane, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So the first thing I want to do is I want to turn on this layer so you can see the plane, and then I'll turn on the plane itself. So you can see here that it's blurred out. I make a smart object of this, okay, because that gives me a lot more controls. I can resize, I can experiment with different intensities of the blurring and so on. So I did that here, and when I double click on this, I open it up. You can see here that I have my blur set at 7. Over here, if I want to make it less blurry, that doesn't look good. It's taking too much away from the center object. So I want to, I certainly don't want to do something like this. But somewhere in the middle here, where like I said, 7, 6, whatever, that looks good. So you just play around with the settings that work best for you. So I'm going to cancel out of that. It's going to stay at 7. Now, one of the things that I also like about smart objects, and I'm going to show you this here, is I'm going to open this up, is that now it gives me a different Photoshop document, okay? And so what I did here, as I mentioned earlier, is that I was able to go in here and start removing some of the same scuff marks, some of the identities of this particular plane that make it look like it's a copy of the other one. So I just sort of move some things around, change some things, etc. Again, if you have decals with numbers on them, this is the time where you probably may want to change some things and such, so you can go ahead and do that. You can even recolor this plane. I'll save that for another tutorial, but you can even recolor the plane to be a different shade, a different color entirely, so they have some very, very unique properties, okay? Again, didn't want to spend a lot of time on this because I'm going to be blurring this, as you saw in the background, so a lot of that's going to get lost anyways. It's just a precautionary step to take, okay? So wanted to do that. All right, so going to go back over here. Just going to close this. So we have our clouds, we have our second plane, etc. The next thing that I wanted to add in here as well was trails. Okay, so I just put that layer below the plane so they can appear behind. And what I did was I just took the trails, I drew some lines. Okay, so you can just basically, I forgot how I did this and I apologize, but I probably had done something along this line here and then filled it with, so I was able to do something that would sort of disappear into the horizon and do something like this, so it seems to get smaller, okay? And then I would fill it white and then I would blur it, okay? So this way it gives you some dimension, some depth, some perspective, okay? So you do something like this, you fill it white, and then you just go ahead and you can blur it, okay? And you can see in this case here, I also made it a smart, I converted to a smart object, and then I added the blur to it as well, okay? So again, smart objects are great. They really give you the opportunity to try different things without making some permanent adjustments and always having to go back. Okay, so the last thing that I added here was some clouds in the foreground. So I'm going to turn on this layer. It's one layer, okay? So I put it in the folder just the same. And then I put some clouds here between the two planes, okay? So it looks like this one's above, coming through some clouds, etc., while this one is sharper. And I did this by design because when you can see that you have the clouds up here obscuring the image just a little bit more, and then also you have the blur, you're really giving the focus on this one plane, okay? So he's got his companion over here, but you're really spending a lot of time focusing on this plane, which is ultimately what I was wanting to achieve in this. All right, so this is going to complete all of the work that we're doing in Photoshop. So once again, I'm saving this image, and I want to make sure that this is going to be part of my library workflow. So again, like I mentioned earlier, I can always go back to certain steps and then recalibrate or reinvent the way I'm going to do the image from that point on, okay? So at this point here, I'm saving this, and the next thing we're going to do is apply the final adjustments using the NIK Color Efex Pro, okay, which is now DxO, but it's DxO Color Efex Pro, and this is going to give us the final look that we have on here, and it's a really great software package. I highly recommend it. Before we apply the Color Efex Pro process to this, we have to go ahead and duplicate the image one last time. So in this instance over here, I've already saved it, and then I'm going to call this one, what I like to do is, I usually call it NIK, but I guess now I can call it DxO. And then I have this, and I'm going to duplicate it, okay? All right, so the reason why I want to duplicate it now is because I'm going to go ahead and flatten the image one last time. But before you flatten the image, this is the part when you want to make sure that you're actually finished with your work, okay? Because all you're doing now is opening up the Color Efex Pro to add filters, so you want to make sure that the work that you're going to be doing this to is complete 100%. So the reason why I'm going to flatten the image here is because Color Efex Pro is going to add filters to the entire image. Now, you can do some things where you're going to be adding it to specific layers and such. That's for another time. In this case, I want to do it to the complete image here, okay? Just for the sake of simplicity. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go up to the top layer, and I'm going to say flatten. Click OK. And now I've flattened my image. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my filters. I'm going to go to NIK Collection, and I'm going to go Color Efex Pro. So once the program opens up, you can see that I have all of my recipes that I saved in previous projects that I've worked on in the past. And you can also note that not every recipe is good for the work that I'm working on right now. So if there's not a consistency in your shoots and you're working on different projects, obviously this probably looks amazing on another photo shoot that I worked, another project that I work on, but not so good for this. So what you choose to do is basically going to be a reflection of your style and your taste. So you'll see that as you go through some of these, there's going to be plenty of renditions of your work that will look really, really nice, but they'll just tell a different kind of story. They'll have a different kind of look to them. It doesn't mean that one's worse than the other. So it's a really nice program to experiment with. I'm not, again, going to go through the details of using the program, of all the settings that you have available to you, but basically the way that this software works is that I have a listing of these different types of filters that I can be applying to this image, and each one of them has very unique controls. And so you can see over here the filters are added. So if you want to go ahead and add a filter, these are the ones that are already there. So when I do this, all I'm doing is clicking on one of these, and then it adds it to the list. and then I end up with some controls that I can work on that will ultimately affect the entire image. So depending on your processing power of your computer and the changes that you're making, some of this can just take a few seconds. It says calculating down below, and then it'll make the final adjustment based on what you see. If you don't like a filter, for instance, you can just either turn it off to see what it looks like without it, or you can get rid of it entirely, okay? Which is what I'm gonna do here. I don't wanna, stack onto one I've already made. Now, what's really important is that when you're done working on filters, especially when you're experimenting, because when you get into this, you're going to be doing a lot of experimenting to get the image that you ultimately want. I think you'll spend more time in here working on your image than you actually probably would in Photoshop. Photoshop, it's all pretty cut and dry as to what you're going to be doing. This is where you're really refining this last image. So here, for instance, is where you'd want to save the recipe, and then when you save your recipe, you would give it a name, and then ultimately it would be available at the first screen that I saw, which was my recipes list, and I have all custom, etc. So this is where I was originally, okay? So to get to where I want to go, I've already gone through this, and to give you an example, if I go down to, here we go, Orc Bomber, you can see that I actually have, is it 4 or 5? 5 sort of recipes that I've created for this, and they all have subtle differences, right? So if I click on this one as an example, this is going to show me some really stark contrast on this. Of course, at this time I wasn't doing anything with the background. I didn't care at that time. I was mostly experimenting, and that's one thing you can do along the way. Now, you can open up Color Efex Pro at any time during any part of your workflow and just start experimenting then to see what kind of final image you want to be working on, okay? Which is some of the things that I've done in my workflow. But over here you can see that I've changed some of my filter settings, okay, that I've put into place over here, and I've been experimenting to see what I think looks best. So for instance, you can see here the red is a little bit more orangish. Over here, I've chosen another one where it's getting a little bit more, I guess, cherry color or watermelon color, if you will. Okay, that's what it looks like to me. And then again, back over here, some different filters that are being applied, right? So you can see this one now gives me a darker sky in the background. And that's why I was saying in the very beginning, don't worry so much about the colors of the sky, etc., because when you bring it into Color Efex Pro, that's where you're going to be doing a lot of your work, okay? So you can see if you take off any one of these filters, they'll make subtle adjustments to the actual image, and some of them may be make a big impact. You can see here that I actually like it with this image on. It changes the color. It gives it a little bit more deep, rich colors. So that's important to me. Some of the detail can be removed, expanded upon. It's all a matter of taste at this point. You're going to see what works well for you, okay? And so the final one that I ended up using is this one here, which is going to be the 5th. And this is what became the final image. Again, there was subtle differences between these two, okay? You can see there's a little bit of a deeper blue at the top here than there is here, okay? So just filter differences that were along the side here. So play with these controls. Once you're done, okay, again, save your recipe so you don't have to remember what all these settings are. And there's much more you can do, by the way, with Color Efex Pro that I'm not getting into, okay? So this is not a Color Efex Pro tutorial, but I'm just using some basic techniques here. I can choose to add some of these filters to certain areas or omit them from other areas using the plus and minus control points, okay? So that'll be another tutorial for another time, but at this point here, I'm just showing you what I'm doing in this case to get the final image. And that's it, guys. All you have to do is just click OK after you've saved it. And when you save it, it's going to take you back into Photoshop. Okay, so now that it's saved, it's created a brand new layer called Color Efex Pro 4 on top of our background layer here, okay, which is this, all right? So very happy with the results. The final touch-ups that I do in this are actually in Lightroom. So, as you would imagine, I'm gonna go ahead and save this. And once it's saved, I'm gonna go back into Lightroom and finish the final processes of everything I think that needs to happen to this image to make it my final composite. Once we get back into Lightroom, the first thing we want to do is we want to go into the folder that we're working on, right click, and then click Synchronize Folder, okay? So you can see here that there's going to be 2 Photoshop images that I was working on that haven't made their way into the folder. I want to have those included, okay? So once I synchronize that, it's going to show me the 2 photos that I was working on. This was the earlier one that I saved before I added the NIK/DxO Color Efex Pro effects to this, okay? So once I'm going to click on this, I'll go into my development mode, and here we have the image itself, okay? So it looks really nice. There's a couple of final things that I just want to do, all right? And again, you could just leave it at where it was. In the development, what I like to do is just take a look at some of the details. So as it relates to the texture, I'm mostly interested in, you know, the spots that I see here. And this is fine, really, it's not that bad. I want to sharpen it just a little bit more, okay? And then I'm going to go ahead and reduce some of the noise and just play along with that. And then I can give myself a little bit more smoothness here, okay? And then finally, anything else you may want to do. If there's anything here that you see that you want to give some final touch-ups to, maybe it's some of the hot spots are too bright, you know, you can take those down a little bit. It's entirely up to you. At this point, you're just basically refining the final project. You know, a lot of this was done before I brought this in, but at the same time, like I said, I'm just going to bring this in for some final refinements. One of the things that I would encourage is that you don't do any vignetting in the Color Efex Pro because it's permanent. In this case over here, I would either do it in Photoshop, or I like to do it in, I'm used to doing it here in Lightroom. Okay, so it doesn't work that well, at least for this image. I'm 100% satisfied with the way it looks without it. But if that's something that you like to do, I just suggest that you do it in Lightroom in the end. And that concludes this tutorial. So if you have any questions along the way, let me know. If you have any processes that you want to share that you may use that are a little bit different, please go ahead and share those in the comments down below. I hope this works well for you. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for future videos just like this one.